Mass media are accomplices of anti-cult terrorists. Mass media play a crucial role in dehumanization and targeted persecution of religious and secular organizations chosen by anti-cultists as their victims. By leveraging their unofficial contacts among media representatives, including journalists, editors, and leaders of major publications, anti-cultists initiate and carry out large-scale and prolonged campaigns to discredit these targeted organizations. In essence, they orchestrate information terrorism.
Therefore, the cult works ahead of the curve.
How do cultist fraudsters turn people into slaves? And how have they managed to evade responsibility for decades? How Jehovah's Witnesses embarked on the path of extremism.
As part of these campaigns, various methods of negative influence are employed, including the use of aggressive rhetoric, hate speech, dissemination of false information, slander, provocations, and incitement to aggression against targeted individuals. In this process, unscrupulous media representatives are recruited into this network of cooperation, willing to engage in dubious actions to achieve their goals, meaning committing information terrorism. Thus, anti-cult organization representatives recruit the direct perpetrators of future attacks. Additionally, anti-cultists create the image of victims from some of the recruited or interested individuals who have allegedly suffered from the malevolent influence of the stigmatized organization. The stories of these pseudo-victims are widely disseminated in defamatory media publications, despite many of these tales being intentional lies.
All this inevitably leads to crime, which in fact exists in the vast majority of cults, or potentially exists in one way or another. Violations of the law begin. At first a few, then more, and then it's more often, and these are obvious crimes, and they absolutely violate all moral norms.
This is how anti-cultists label a targeted group as dangerous and manipulative, though in reality, it is their own actions that are dangerous and manipulative. Through their people in the media, they conduct genuine psychological processing of society. This, in turn, allows them to manipulate the aggressive sentiments of the public, the sentiments that they themselves have provoked. They implant explicit narratives in people's subconscious that all the organizations they label are cults and are dangerous, and that cult members are non-humans. This simple formula plays on the basic instincts of every person, evoking fear for their own lives and the lives of their children, creating an image of a constantly looming threat. Naturally, the reaction to this stimulus is self-defense, with only two options, fight or flight. Since anti-cultists accompany their propaganda with incitement to hatred and encouragement of unlawful acts, the dominant response becomes fight or even destroy. Under this scheme, anti-cultists can dehumanize and demonize any organization they consider undesirable, pushing it outside the bounds of the social field. When you hear the word dehumanization, it might seem abstract to you. If so, I invite you to listen to the stories of the outcomes of its practice on the specific example.
Alexander Dworkin's anti-cult terrorist activities. For many years, RACIRS representatives have been spreading hostile statements towards numerous new religious movements. Their meetings, interviews, lectures, and public activities have created a hostile atmosphere in society, often leading to subsequent manifestations of hatred and xenophobia among the population. For instance, the ringleader of the anti-cult group in Russia, radical ideologist Alexander Dworkin, has waged an active disinformation campaign against the Christian movement of Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia since the beginning of his anti-cult career in 1993. Dworkin used all forms of propaganda against the followers of this organization, from defamatory articles in newspapers, magazines, and internet portals, to media appearances where he gave highly negative assessments of this religious group, accusing and portraying their activities in the worst possible light.
The Jehovah's Witnesses came to an Orthodox Christian country. They insult me and my faith, and in this sense, I have the right to respond to them. My book is a response to their persistent molestation and their relentless recruitment. These Jehovah's Witnesses manipulate the minds of their members, but they also make enormous amounts of money. Usually, when Jehovah's Witnesses speak, they certainly squeeze out everything they can. Jehovah's Witnesses, by definition, cannot be called Christians, no matter what they call themselves, because they do not consider Christ to be God. Jehovah's Witnesses are undoubtedly a totalitarian sect, because Jehovah's Witnesses are a commercial cult.
For instance, in mid-2009, Dvorkin gave an interview to the federal Russian channel NTV, where among other harsh statements, he compared Jehovah's Witnesses to drug dealers and called them slaves.
In fact, what they give for free is similar to how a drug dealer in an alley gives the first shot for free. And he might even give the second shot for free. But to get the third shot, people run to him and bring money. This is done by people for free, who live in Bethels and work irregular hours in exchange for a bed in a dormitory and meals in a common dining hall. Food comes from Jehovah's Witnesses' farms. Similar slaves produce the food there. In other words, the expenses are minimal.
This interview, which was clearly propagandistic, contributed to a surge of hatred and aggression against Jehovah's Witnesses and caused a drastic increase in religiously motivated crimes in Russia, including attacks on prayer houses and private homes of believers, as well as threats and brutal physical violence. Here's a far from complete list of acts of violence against Jehovah's Witnesses, committed by Russian citizens in 2009-2010 following Dvorkin's speeches. An attack was carried out on the home of an elderly Jehovah's Witness couple, with their windows being shattered by stones. A schoolboy whose parents are Jehovah's Witnesses was attacked. 2 female Jehovah's Witnesses were assaulted, with one being struck on the head and losing consciousness. 2 female Jehovah's Witnesses were brutally insulted and severely beaten. 2 female Jehovah's Witnesses were attacked, one being pushed down a flight of stairs and the other kicked in the back. An attack on a Kingdom Hall of Jehovah's Witnesses resulted in the beating of the security guards and the building being set on fire.
The Jehovah's Witnesses cult doesn't hold up because of their ridiculous, absurd, self-contradictory faith. It holds up through the strict control of the cult. It's a very strict totalitarian sect and cult. Pedophilia. There are actually hundreds of cases of pedophilia, and the cult has covered them up every time.
Cults, 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 cults.
Jehovah's Witnesses are a cult.
Hands off our children. Belgorod is a cult-free territory.
And this is just a small part of the consequences of merely 1 year of public activity by just one representative of the anti-cult movement in one country. Dvorkin's public, extremist, and baseless statements led to a series of attacks and acts of violence against Jehovah's Witnesses and other religious groups in various regions of Russia in 2009-2010. Numerous cases have also been recorded where large families of Jehovah's Witnesses were harmed in various ways, had their property damaged, and had their homes burned to the ground. All of this was done by individuals influenced by Dvorkin's manipulative speeches, which carry a hidden message of denying human rights of stigmatized groups of people and turning them into public targets.
That's right. Persecuted. You must be persecuted. Because it's just a nightmare. It's a cult.
Why put people in prison? You have your truth. We have our truth. But there are more of us than you. If they cross the red line, not only the line, in the past these were stoned to death.
Again, raising the issue of destructiveness, totalitarian sects may be compared to a circle of scorched earth that constantly expands, leaving only scorched earth and ruins inside. Such spiritual casualties, crippled individuals, remain outside. They are cast out and then thrown back into society, for society itself to somehow rehabilitate them and deal with their problems.
Let's consider an example of using a manipulative method aimed at forming an image of the enemy and dehumanizing certain groups of people. Please note that in his public speeches, Alexander Dvorkin regularly repeats the following stigmatizing comparison.
Another name for totalitarian sects is destructive cults. Destructive meaning ruinous, like cancerous cells that enter the body and spread metastases throughout the organism until the body dies. Cults behave in society like a cancerous tumor in one's body, draining nutrients from society and feeding off it until the body itself dies. Just as a cancerous tumor destroys the body, a cult similarly destroys society from within.
Dvorkin's use of such metaphors as scorched earth and cancerous tumor in relation to people who are labeled sectarians or cultists is not accidental. Dvorkin deliberately voices these vivid negative figurative comparisons in order to bypass your critical thinking and dehumanize representatives of those communities in your eyes, intentionally associating them with something extremely dangerous and harmful, something that requires immediate elimination. Such a comparison activates the mechanisms of black and white thinking in your mind when an object that a manipulative narrative is focused on is regarded as an absolute evil requiring unconditional rejection. At the same time, Dvorkin himself is perfectly aware that his radical rhetoric is a blatant violation of human rights and a manifestation of extremism. So, in order to avoid direct accusations of inciting aggression towards people, from lecture to lecture he plays safe by voicing another manipulative statement. We don't fight cultists, we fight cults.
We are often asked a standard journalistic question. Tell us, how do you fight cultists? And I always have the same answer to that. I don't fight cultists, I fight cults.
The phrase "we fight cults" and not cultists, often used by Dvorkin and his followers, is a prime example of semantic manipulation. This statement contains a dichotomy that creates an illusion of differentiation between the concept of a cult as an organization and the real people who are its members. However, in reality, such a differentiation is impossible since any organization consists of people and cannot exist without them. Dvorkin's manipulative statement ignores the fact that the activities of the organizations he called cults and the personalities of the so-called cultists are inextricably linked. This means that he calls people cancerous tumors and scorched earth, thereby causing public hatred towards them. To make the essence of this manipulation clearer to you, please answer the following question. When you heard this comparative metaphor that cults are cancerous tumors, what image appeared in your mind? Some kind of abstract image of a cult? Or did you see an image of specific personalities whom you associate with the word cult, whom you yourself know or saw in the media? Your consciousness actually displayed an image of people because the image and mental command that Dvorkin instilled through such verbal manipulations consists in the following message: cultists are dangerous. They must be exterminated. Such manipulative techniques used by representatives of the anti-cult clique provoke cognitive dissonance in your mind, forcing you to accept negative images without critical assessment of those. This provocation of cognitive dissonance is a form of mental violence, inasmuch as it undermines independence of a person's thinking, forcibly instills hatred in him towards his fellow citizens, and gives him a direct instruction for violent actions. Please note that anti-cultists use this technique of covert cultivation of hatred to your detriment in many spheres of life, when they need to make you hate those people whom they target, when they need to set one part of society against another, causing a wave of hatred and violence within society.
Manipulative methods used by Alexander Dvorkin constitute illegal actions that have already caused severe psychological, moral, and physical suffering among the population and have led to many deaths, details of which will be discussed later. Dvorkin's public statements bear clear signs of incitement to hatred and meet all the criteria of the threshold test established under the Rabat Plan of Action. According to widely recognized international legal norms, such activities should be prohibited by law, and all individuals involved in their execution should be held accountable in accordance with the law.
Interestingly, Alexander Dvorkin, the leader of anti-cult organizations and the author of the term totalitarian sect, opposes the introduction of a legal definition for cult. This is because it would then be necessary to prove, based on facts, that an organization is indeed a totalitarian sect or destructive cult, and that the accusations against it have a factual basis. As the leader of the anti-cult movement in Russia himself stated, most of these cases would be lost.
22 years ago, I started dealing with cults. I used to say that we urgently needed to introduce a legal term cult to address this issue. However, soon I realized that it is absolutely impossible to do it now, in the current situation. Because if we were to introduce the legal term cult tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, courts would be flooded with lawsuits from those very cults that would be saying, prove that we are a cult, and present all the evidence to support such a definition. Prove that we comply with this definition. Thus, a large portion of lawsuits would likely be lost. Then, by court decision, we would no longer be able to call various organizations cults, even the most sinister and disgusting ones.
Definition of the terms sect and cult in the law would automatically restrict their unjustified use, which in turn would deprive anti-cultists of their main tool that represents a starting point for subsequent illegal actions.
Now, we at least don't have such a legal term, therefore we can call cults cults. And I personally withstood 5 legal proceedings. In fact, any person can call an organization cult with no fear of punishment if he considers it to be a cult, and there is nothing that can be done. This is what I'm expressing. It's a religious science term, it's a theological term. I'm expressing my opinion, and they won't be able to do anything about it.
It is worth remembering that using the term sect or cult in an accusatory or demonizing way is a direct violation of the constitutional rights of citizens in a democratic society, in particular, freedom of conscience and freedom of religion. Through such actions, anti-cultists, who decided that they are entitled to pass such a sentence on any individual or group of people, basically seek to supersede law enforcement agencies and the law.
At a time when anti-cult terrorists carry out their destructive activities in various countries, introducing the mindsets they need among masses of people, the number of hate crimes against religions and beliefs is growing proportionally. A huge number of people across the world who became targets of purposeful persecution have been facing abuse, physical violence, and forced isolation for many years and decades. They experience mental violence, moral oppression, fear, and humiliation.
When someone tries to label you as a cultist, it's extremely dangerous. Essentially, such a label in society marks you as a target that can and should be destroyed. This is similar to how the Nazis once forced Jews to wear yellow stars. This mark created a chasm between Jews and the rest of the population, highlighting their difference, marking them as others and non-humans, and making them easy targets for aggression on the part of people influenced by propaganda. The yellow star signaled that its wearers could be treated as less than human. Using the yellow star was one of many ways the Nazis dehumanized Jews and prepared the ground for their mass extermination. Ultimately, this labeling led to one of the most tragic chapters in human history, the Holocaust. Today, anti-cultists use the same methods, assigning labels like cult and sect to various organizations, thereby separating them from society and stripping them of their status as people. These labels take away their democratic rights and freedoms, telling society that these people are different and that they can be deprived of their rights, treated without respect, and even with violence. During the Nazi era, the harsh treatment of Jews was the result of well-organized propaganda. The media of that time were tools for creating the image of the enemy, despite the lack of facts and evidence. Similarly, today, innocent people labeled as cult or sect members by anti-cultists become victims of accusations for crimes they did not commit.
Because a cultist, a member of a totalitarian sect, if required to lie, steal, kill, and so on, he simply doesn't think twice but follows the order. Because he would act, for the benefit of the whole world, for the salvation of humanity and so on. What does some insignificant human life matter that gets in the way of this? Undoubtedly, for this, any means are justified.
But that's more of a fanatic than a cultist.
Any cultist is actually a fanatic by definition.
You use the term war, saying we need a war. I mean, these are different kinds of people. Doesn't it bother you? This is just an emotional question.
Well, it's a fight. It's a war. Call it what you wish, but it really
doesn't bother me.
It's a war against inhuman organizations that enslave people and deprive them of freedom.
Stigmatizing certain groups and communities by defining them as cult, totalitarian sect, or destructive cult shapes public perception of them as highly negative and dangerous entities. This leads to the marginalization of these communities as social groups and their discrimination within society. They are met with suspicion, insulted, humiliated, and ridiculed. People refuse to hire them, collaborate with them, or engage in personal relationships with them. The problems these individuals face are numerous, from public condemnation, conflicts, and threats to physical violence, criminal prosecution, searches, and more. Stigmatized individuals become targets. They are hated, despised, and avoided. They are met with anger and disgust. They can face anything, from disdainful avoidance to violence, including murder. And this happens solely because anti-cultists chose them as targets. Constant demonization and hate speech undoubtedly have a severe negative impact on the physical and psychological health of the victim. This topic has been extensively researched by psychologists and psychiatrists. A report published by the American Psychological Association compares the symptoms observed in victims of hate crimes to those of post-traumatic stress disorder. A study conducted in the United States in 2001 showed that victims of hate crimes experience more severe consequences than victims of other types of crimes. Victims of prejudice, members of stigmatized groups, often experience depression, which may include sadness, fatigue, anhedonia, hopelessness, social withdrawal, or even catatonia. Victims of prejudice also experience stigma, a state of personal shame and devaluation, which is a crucial component of depression. They experience an increased number of suicidal thoughts and other mental health issues. For victims of prejudice, suicide offers an escape from the hatred they face, driven by despair and a desire to flee. Suicidal victims of prejudice do not wish to harm themselves. They simply want to avoid the harm inflicted upon them by others. A classic example of creators of stereotypes and enforcers of prejudices are the Nazis.
Branded and socially isolated, the victims of anti-cultists feel much like the victims of the Holocaust once did. The fact is, the targets of anti-cultist terrorism, whether an organization or an individual subjected to persecution and attacks, feel doomed and eventually come to terms with their situation. This is comparable to how Holocaust victims resign themselves to their fate, knowing they were inevitably facing execution or the gas chamber. The hopelessness and fear of the inevitable traumatize a person on a subconscious level. Even though the conscious mind tries to suppress and push away this fear, the subconscious trauma remains deeply rooted. Imagine what these people experience and how their lives unfold after enduring such trauma. So, the labels of sect or cult used by anti-cultists are not just words. They are tools that lead to the destruction of the foundations of humanity. The history of Nazism's impact on the world teaches us that when society starts to divide people into us and them, it leads to irreparable consequences.
One of your statements. Orthodox Christians are no better than everyone else. If they were, the whole world would have become Orthodox a long time ago. Maybe we are even worse than everyone else. But Orthodoxy is definitely the only direct path to God. What gives you the right to state that? And I think it's a statement, first of all. Secondly, isn't this inciting, at any rate to some degree, of interreligious hostility or intolerance?
Well, no, not at all. Because first of all, every religion considers itself true while all others are mistaken. A member of any religion can say this. The path of Indian asceticism is only to attain eternal death, to attain eternal non-being. And in this, of course, lies the demonic nature of Hinduism. When you see two women in the street brainwashing a mother with a stroller, you can approach her and say, don't listen to them. They are cultists, Jehovah's Witnesses. They grossly distort the Holy Scripture.
Isn't this inciting, at any rate to some degree, of interreligious hostility or intolerance?
Well, no, not at all. Muhammad, although he belonged to that powerful tribe, he was from its poor branch. So he was a rather poor man. He got a job with his distant relative, the twice-widowed Khadijah, and started leading her caravans, gaining her trust. And when he was 25 years old, Khadijah, who was then over 40, married for the third time her pretty-faced clerk. Inciting interreligious hostility is if I insult specific bearers of one or another particular religious idea. The principle of Orthodox Christian relations with other religions is respect for every person. Long before he arrived, all of Moscow was covered with posters of this man with a horse-like face, and it was inscribed that the great Tony Robbins had arrived, and everyone was wondering what this was all about. Then Muhammad had some strange visions and revelations. Some people believe he had epileptic seizures. Tom Cruise is the Goebbels of Scientology, the minister of propaganda. Thorov himself is a very gray and dark man. He speaks very boringly. He is sort of like a very dull, gray person, and respect for every person. Who do we know? What cultists do we know? Street beggars? Annoying recruiters who knock on our doors? Cults are dangerous at the societal level because, unlike traditional denominations that enrich society and create culture, cults give nothing to society. We don't know cultists who are respect for every person. Writers, artists, music composers, philosophers, and so on, they only drain society of its vital resources, just like a cancerous tumor pulls the vital resources from the body until it eventually destroys it.
The cancerous tumor pulls the vital resources from the body until it eventually destroys it.
We can discuss each of the cults, many of them, talking about how exactly these totalitarian schemes are embodied in their teachings. The International Society for Krishna Consciousness, or the Hare Krishnas. This cult had a lot they would like to conceal. There was drug trafficking, arms trade, and murders. Overall, it is quite obvious that the International Society for Krishna Consciousness is a ruthless group aiming to seize power. It is built on strict totalitarian principles and dreams of spreading those principles to the entire global population. It seems clear that this is one of the attempts of the impending Antichrist. It is obvious. Perhaps the International Society for Krishna Consciousness is one of the actual forerunners of the Antichrist who ultimately seeks to seize power worldwide. Possibly, it is through these very methods that his advent is being prepared. There can be no equality between Orthodox Christianity, which has existed in Russia for 1,000 years, and a tiny marginal cult like the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, which appeared here just a couple of decades ago, but loudly demands to be recognized on a par with orthodoxy and given preferential treatment.
There was an attack on the temple of the Moscow Society.
In Barnaul, there was an attempted attack on Krishna worshippers.
Krishna worshippers were beaten in Moscow.
Krishna devotee was beaten.
Scientology is one of the most dangerous totalitarian sects, and Scientology surpasses many cults in its destructiveness. I've seen many ex-Scientologists who are absolutely just severely mentally ill. I'll repeat again, cults are very aggressive and very deceitful. with the mentality of a slave and the mentality of a whistleblower. He works for intelligence services. He's been gathering information since he was a child. I mean, he brings money, he brings information. If you're in Scientology, when you finally run out of everything, when you run out of money and your mental health or physical health, they will get rid of you. They will throw you out on the street and forget about you.
FSB released video of searches at Scientology centers.
Searches in Moscow in connection with the case of Scientology.
Court sentenced 5 Scientologists.
White Scientologists Scientology organizations have been declared undesirable.
Among neo-Pentecostals, there is a tithe, but again, no one counts it. Yet, there is such an ordinary elementary principle of extortion. It's an alternative version of Christianity created by the enemy of the human race, which is called Christianity, and from which the entire essence of Christianity has been hollowed out. Neo-Pentecostals are 300,000 plus activists who will go where they are told and do what they are ordered to do. This is not a figure of speech.
On the Pentecostal
Oman
church
attacked
in
Pentecostals. Searches conducted at the homes of leaders of the new generation of
Residents
Pentecostals.
disrupted a Pentecostal worship service.
Charge. Thus, public activities of the ringleader of the Russian anti-cult clique, Alexander Dvorkin, exhibit signs of crimes associated with terrorist activities. Hostile statements that create an atmosphere of intolerance, resulting in verbal abuse, threats, and physical attacks on people, as well as attacks on buildings, including arson. This is incitement to commit terrorist acts that spread hatred and endanger lives. It also hinders the enjoyment of human rights, including the right to life, liberty, and security. Therefore, according to the definition in the UN General Assembly resolution adopted on June 22, 2023, this activity constitutes terrorism.
An aggravating circumstance is Dvorkin's deliberate use of special hidden manipulative methods and technologies aimed at covert influence, programming, and control of human behavior. Their use is directly evidenced by the fact that his public activities provoked a wave of violence among the population towards stigmatized victims, including physical violence against them, up to murders. These manipulative technologies operate bypassing critical perception through consciousness and directly affecting a person's deep subconsciousness. It is exactly the destructive mindsets and commands implanted into people's subconsciousness without their knowledge that force people to subsequently commit acts of violence and hatred against targeted individuals, chosen not by themselves, but by Dvorkin. He has artificially incited a wave of hatred and negativity in people and forced them to act. In a literal sense, Dvorkin has directed those individuals, like torpedoes, against their will and desire towards his chosen targets. Therefore, all those individuals who committed acts of aggression against other people who are just like them, but marked by anti-cultists with a yellow star, are also victims of informational terror attacks. Dvorkin had programmed them for those actions in advance at the level of subconsciousness. When he used manipulative technologies in his speeches, they were literally forced to act this way. And unknowingly, by attacking innocent people, they were enacting someone else's malicious will. This is why Dvorkin's speeches had such a powerful effect on people, although in the overwhelming majority of cases, evidence for his accusatory speeches was not presented. The mere utterance of these labels was enough to provoke an explosive reaction in society and a wave of brutality against the labeled groups.
The use of these hidden manipulative technologies within the anti-cult movement was first introduced by Alexander Dvorkin. This has since become a common practice for creating informational terror attacks by all anti-cult organizations, including RACIRS and FECRIS. These very methods enable anti-cults to influence people against their will. Moreover, it doesn't matter if this happens directly through personal contact or remotely through media messages. The power of influence remains unchanged. More details about the technology itself, as well as about the source where Dvorkin received it from, will be provided a little later.
Representatives of anti-cult organizations use foul techniques of manipulative psychological influence on the masses to carry out real acts of terrorism. Until recently, it was believed that informational and psychological terror attacks were not as frightening as physical ones because they supposedly did not kill anyone directly like a bomb explosion would. But in reality, informational terror attacks are much more dangerous and destructive, most of all because they are conducted covertly, operating at the subconscious level, easily penetrating the critical thinking barrier of the conscious mind and infecting people with destructive beliefs, thereby creating new terrorists. The impact radius of such attacks is much larger than physical ones because by acting through the informational space, they are not limited by space or time. The most terrifying aspect of this situation is that for a very long time, up to today, a vast number of real terrorists have remained unpunished. However, while their methods of influencing the depths of the subconscious can go unnoticed by the masses, the demonization and groundless accusations of groups of people stigmatized by representatives of anti-cult organizations and systematic violation of the presumption of innocence are always in full sight. Even by this one factor alone, they can now be easily identified and held accountable to the fullest extent of the law for their complicity in and perpetration of terrorism.